Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Healing the Divide podcast. I'm so grateful to be sitting down today with Gabriel Axel Montes. Gabriel is a neuroscientist, a consciousness researcher and enthusiast, a facilitator and musician. He has 15 years of fusing neuroscience with mind hacking, conducting research and teaching globally. Actually, right now he's joining us from Hong Kong. So I think we're going to get a little bit into U.S.-China relations here at some point. But Gabriel is the founder of Neuroprint, a patent-pending brainwave-based authentication technology, and of Pathform, a platform for cultivating qualities of consciousness. He's the founding member and guitarist of the world's first music act featuring an AI-powered humanoid robot vocalist. I can't wait to get into this. This is, and you'll have to help me with the pronunciation, but Desdemona's Dream? Did I pronounce this?
Dream.
Desdemona's Dream, aka Jam Galaxy Band. Gabriel has been working in emerging technologies since 2017, including AI, virtual reality, blockchain, robotics, and Internet of Things. He advises on the integration of these technologies in the form of spatial web and espouses beneficent orchestration of technological advancement and digital transformation. Also can't wait to dive into this. Especially oriented toward resolving collective global challenges. Gabriel is a father, a husband, and a world traveler. His passion is adventures in consciousness, a psychonaut of sorts, and the practical application. Gabriel, welcome to Healing the Divide.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to have you here, man. So for our listeners and viewers, Gabriel and I've known each other for a while. We both have a background in studying consciousness through the yogic arts and disciplines. I've had the opportunity to sit in on workshops that Gabriel has facilitated and watch his journey from afar, and it's been utterly fascinating. So he's one of the first people I reached out to in creating this podcast because he is taking a unique tack on the application of higher consciousness practices, fusing them with advancements in technology and applying them to critical spaces of, quite honestly, where existential risk lives. And I'm curious about all of that and excited to dive in to this long form convo. So all this to be said, first question I wanted to kind of hit you with, Gabriel, is as a neuroscientist, so putting on the neuroscientist hat for a moment, but also like the yogi hat at the same time. For someone who studied the nature of consciousness so up close, but from different lenses, how do you hold the relationship between science and spirituality? Is there congruence? Is there conflict in terms of spirit, consciousness, God? I'm going to throw you all the loaded terms and just kind of get your big picture umbrella overview of these two ideas and how they cohabitate or don't within your purview.
Great question. I think the feeling I have about almost the way I hold these ideas, as well as everything in the collective sphere and in myself, as well as a developing, consciousness, is that the answer keeps changing and unfolding and evolving over the course of my life, especially as you reflect on the past and let go of and kind of reframe and gain new perspectives on old questions or reframe questions themselves. So, I would say sort of chronologically, I was sort of born a scientist, and then it's sort of meaning I had a natural disposition for biology, let's put it that way. in school and so on. And it kind of, that's just the path it sort of took me. And I kind of, you know, homed in on DNA and cells. And then once I became more interested in psychology and the mind, it took me towards neuroscience. Then, you know, I kept going with that through high school. And when I was 15, I had a spontaneous out of body experience. It wasn't, you know, really deep out of body, but it was out of body, and there was perspective on my body, and I had this feeling that I was more than the body. And I would say, even going back, the first experience that I recall was around when I was 4 or 5 years old. There was a feeling of the soul, of being older than my body, and it's something that felt like it was across lifetimes, in a way. And so that feeling was never quite forgotten, but as my logical mind took over, as I was growing up in school and just in life and so on, I had two doctor parents, basically. So that sort of, let's call it left-brained, to use that sort of schema. That's sort of the twig and the tree kind of went that way, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I had to have reminders over the course of my life to remember something more than kind of the material. Even though I was always interested in the creative, the material, I grew up a musician, so I always had that kind of, let's say, left and right brain tendencies. Um, so the way that I hold them now, and again, it's always changing, you know, year to year, 6 months to 6 months time frames, is that science, it's sort of like an epistemology. It's a way of knowing things, meaning you are saying there is value in the collective advancement of our species in knowing things together. And to know things together, we use tools that a lot of us have access to, and you know, that could mean, and that we can communicate about in some sort of standard or standardized manner, right? So then that's different from kind of saying we use the same language and we say, do you see that over there? Yes, that does result in like common knowledge and culture. That said, you know, there are ways of knowing that are also kind of third person, right? Empirical. And you could say, oh yes, it has this shape. We have these measuring instruments, we can replicate it. And so there's value in this sort of exterior way of looking at things. Because of the nature of the way that knowledge evolves, it's slower. And then there's all of a sudden like a punctuated advancement, you know, every so often in different fields and areas. So it's fun. It's fun to be connected to that, because you know that you don't overinflate your own way of knowing something. That being said, I've always felt that I'm sort of ahead of the data in a sense, right? Like I'll read about something and it'll be, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. But how about 100 years from now? How will we frame that? What's that gonna sound like and be like? Will this sound sort of, you know, ancient by the time that we get there? So I've personally have had more interest in how far can the consciousness go. One aspect of science, even if someone doesn't know anything about science, is sort of the scientific method of just sort of, you know, some degree of critical thinking, you know, asking a question, knowing you know, what response you get to that, and seeing if, you know, how common this might be, if that matters, depending on what the question is, right? So I think for me personally, I sort of wore the neuroscientist costume and kind of took it seriously for a while, but I could feel the urge to go beyond it constantly. And my heart and my sense of comfort is, despite having, you know, my master's and my PhD and all that, in neuroscience, my comfort is still in, and where I feel the most excitement is the sort of the the development of consciousness, individually, as well as making sense of things collectively, you know, dropping belief systems, that sort of stuff, I feel is more like beyond university tier in a way of doing.
Mhm.
I do feel that the foundation of neuroscience and science allows me to have good literacy in what I read and to question even whatever theories anyone comes up with. I'm like, well, let's take a look at that. How do you know that? What how one might know such a thing? Not with this kind of snobby skepticism at all. It's more of like a just playful inquisitiveness.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I can feel like the spirituality of science. Like there's something so beautiful in, I guess the word that I'll use is curiosity, that is pervasive in the very premise of science itself, the desire to ascertain truth. And whether that is through objective means or subjective means, it seems that based on our nature and our experience being inclusive of both of these aspects, that they don't necessarily necessitate conflict or mutual exclusivity, but they actually possess this sort of complementary and co-creative quality that you seem to embody, where the empirical knowledge and the instruments through which you come to it sort of keep you honest and against the potential perils of subjective bias, and yet to know enough to not be shackled or limited and confined to the empirical solely, that sort of dry materialism leaves out the curiosity of who's asking, what are the limitations of the instruments by which we're measuring, what are the senses by which we're coming into making sense, and is there more available to us as a species? And even within the sort of constraints of just a purely evolutionary worldview, we are evolving. And what more is there to discover within consciousness itself? So I love the answer, and I guess it sort of brings me to another second question for you. Do you believe, after studying the brain in depth, that the brain is the source of consciousness? Do you view consciousness as the source of the brain, body, material, not just individuality, but, do you see consciousness as sort of part and parcel of matter, from stardust to the chairs that we're sitting on? Do you see those relationships as even being causal one way or the other, correlative? How do you hold the relationship between consciousness and matter?
Great framing, and the choice of words about causality, correlation, etc. All really key. So after sort of tossing around this question and grappling with this over a while, my sort of and again, all these conclusions are provisional because there's a constant question mark in parentheses over how I'll language these things or how I'll perceive them. But I definitely have a heterodoxical view or non-orthodox view in terms of being a neuroscientist. I believe so. The kind of nuance I've found as a way to explain this is that the brain is a producer of consciousness, and the producer is like a movie producer, right? So the movie producer is where the resources come from. Like, what resources are there to create a show, right? So the resources are, well, wetware, you've got tissues, you've got cells, you've got legs, you've got arms, you've got eyes, you've got all these different faculties. And you have cognition, decision-making, judgment. Okay, so let's put on a show with that. Let's make the greatest show we can with that and all the other actors that are like that. So the producer is not the source of the essence, the creativity, etc. They're a shaper. They're like a vessel. And so this is where we start to get into the trickiness of language, because you can use the same word like mind and consciousness to mean different things. So, are we talking about the water that's in the vessel, or are we talking about the vessel itself? So by being the executive producer, I like to draw the distinction, meaning the brain as an executive producer. I like to draw the distinction there of it being the vessel that shapes the water. Let's use a crude analogy. The water itself is going to be the way it's experienced is going to be initially filtered through this fractal, this holon, right? This sort of chunk of the universe that we call the human being. And just like a baby learning to grapple with itself, and it's kind of in this oceanic, dual, just ocean of awareness, undifferentiated, and learning to kind of like walk and understand what hunger is and understand this, what mom is, what mom isn't. Those are that's the kind of process that goes as consciousness is going through the brain, and the body. And in parentheses, I'll say there's a bit of neurocentrism as well. That's a very Western thing. I would say it's the brain is just one piece of the whole. Even in certain animals, and I think as a nematodes, if you cut off the brain, like the body will regrow, or the brain will even regrow. I forget which way it is, or parts of it will. Right. So there's encoding all over the place for other parts of our systems. Now, so I think at a non-embodied consciousness, meaning the consciousness that is sort of more pre-embodiment, I believe that there is something we can call consciousness there. There is some materia, there's some substance, and I believe that is graded in different ways. So there's sort of the most undifferentiated, and I point up because it's just kind of the way that the geometry of our spatial awareness, you'll point up to something that comes from the stars, and before it's human, I think there's some intuition there, right? So I believe that there is something in the fabric of all of existence that if you try to say, no, consciousness is separate from that, that is almost a violent act where you're saying, no, you're trying to rip something out from part of itself, right? So I'm not sure if someone might call this, I think most people would call this like panpsychism. I would even go a step further. So I think panpsychism, again, words are interesting, right? Because we can say consciousness is everywhere, but a lot of times we expect consciousness to have some anthropomorphic quality, and it's hard to get away from that. What is human-like about something versus what isn't? So I would say I like to use the word pan-experientialism, which is that everything is having some kind of proto-experience, and it's part of the essence of that thing sort of discovering its own existence and growing, and it's part of its feedback mechanism. There's going to be some aspect of experience there. It's not going to be necessarily self-aware like we are. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. That's a metacognitive layer on top of an experience, right? Some degree of self-awareness. That network connection may not be active in every part of the universe, meaning every atom. However, I do believe there is some baseline that exists, and then depending on what form it's taking, the producer is different. So a plant is going to have a different, an animal, different kinds of animals, different, so on and so forth. So there's different terms, that meaning different definitions of the same word. So mind, consciousness, big M mind, little mind M. These things start becoming all sorts of different directions.
First, I want to presence the beautiful sound of your little boy in the other room in the background. And for everybody that's listening, like Gabriel and I chatted about this when we were checking our sounds beforehand. And it's honestly, it's the most beautiful symphony of laughter and play into the background of this conversation. Like, I would not want the podcast any other way, because as I'm listening to you and hearing your story of like how you came into the world and the experiences, the out of body experience, and like the sense of being soul and the sense of curiosity and into the science. And you hear this like little playful banter in the background. It just reminds me of the innocence of the journey of just, wow. I mean, we are all such babies into this whole thing. And you said that this is all a, well, I forget the word that you used. I think you said provisional. And it's funny because as you were saying that, I was writing down the great mystery on my notes, with a question mark. And I wrote next to the question mark, to me, this is the most sacred symbol of all the symbology that we have. And so I just want to presence that. And then, so to what you shared, if there is some sort of, I'm going to simplify and summarize to the best of my ability, some sort of universal, let's call it just universality, that pervades the diversity and multiplicity of the phenomenological experience. Call that by whatever name you will. We can call it consciousness for shorthand, and I think we're both on the same page that we're not necessarily saying mind as the field through which that is expressed, or brain, the biological organism that produces that expression, or thought, the mechanism of sort of molecular form that you, to kind of like give shape to, and this sort of concretizing of what we might call an idea that becomes belief. Not that, but the substance, the essence of which this all is, but not just thought forms. But the idea that I hear you saying is that even into the density of something that seems to be solid in its properties, as the Buddhists and the quantum physicists might share, that we could break that down. And ultimately, there seems to be, I want to kind of lean into the Vedanta teaching for a moment. There's one of the Mahavakyas, it's like a sacred utterance for people that aren't familiar, and it's called Prajnanam Brahmasi. And it says, essentially, Prajnanam is like, with knowledge or consciousness is Brahman, and Brahman is the word, actually our word branch, is etymologically rooted to this word that means to shine, to expand, to proliferate, and that are we consciousness creating itself out of itself constantly, and then maybe it's not a before, which implies time, but a behind, which implies behind this veil of space-time maya or appearance, into projecting into this, where the creation will match the frequency from which it's created, and that our impelled will would be to then raise the consciousness to create creations that bring the highest order of harmony to this experience of life. And if that's true, and we're in that adual or non-dual relationship to all that is, then, and if everything has that piece of it in it, then could we then make the argument that AI is that too? That AI is spirit?
Yeah, that's deep. I mean, that covers a lot of different things. And so first of all, about the children, that's like my main practice right now, really, is the kids
Yeah.
and the reflection process. It's just, that is what it is. It's here every day, almost all day. I'm largely at home, like I'm not really going to an office. So I love that, and we can talk more about that for sure anytime. It's just there's something that's hard to define and qualify because there's so much presencing involved in being with
Mm-hmm.
a growing being who's reflecting off of you, and this whole thing. It's beautiful.
It's a whole other
In
podcast.
terms of, yeah, yes, definitely talking about fatherhood, parenthood, and growth is its own space. I think there's a lot to learn actually about healing the divide, by how I think almost children are the way we relate with our own inner child, and an external process, a child that is growing, and how you relate with that, and relating with others in that way could yield some lessons and some scaling back of the noise. So
Yes, yes,
Um,
yes.
you know, um,
Like
so I mean,
behind
I
every
love,
big emotion is like the experience of feeling little. Like when people are getting big, I literally go right to, oh my God, they're feeling little. Can I meet the little one behind the big experience that I'm seeing in front of me?
yeah, yeah. I mean, connecting to what someone is feeling, not what they're saying. I think that's the simplest way I can kind of put, uh, getting back on track with constructive dialogue and collaboration and conversation. It's like this person's saying something. They have their own way of saying things, depending on their life and their constitution and how they grew up. Um, that said, what is that person fundamentally feeling? Where are they coming from? And what kind of questions? So usually when I'm in conversation, I'll kind of like almost do like a quick flash, like a camera shot, like back into where someone is coming from. I won't like linger
Hmm.
there, but I'll just kind of get a feel for it, and then I'll try my best to co-sense or to kind of um, answer from that place without also getting too resonant and getting sucked in, because that's another. We can talk about this whole spirituality thing, because a lot of people that get into spirituality are actually coming from trauma and lack of boundaries, and so it's easy for them to jump into transcendence, and to get
To bypass.
stuck onto something, to bypass, right? So that also means that in relating you can get into like eye gazing fundamentalism or something like, let's just do this, Scott, and nothing else. It's useful, right? But like imagine, you know let's do it, but like
Let's do it.
how do we do it? It's like you could be there and you could just be feeling, and we're just both eating each other's narcissism and getting more and more narcissistic as we do it. So there's all these nuances. It's wild. um but you had a question about the Brahmin and the AI, right? um
Yes, if all is
so
everything at some level, is AI not that too?
yeah, so I think this is one of those Mobius strip type of things, where it's a bit paradoxical. I think there's kind of two answers, and this ties into some larger framework. So about how to view AI and its consciousness and sentience.
Mhm.
If we can talk about its sentience, maybe not yet, but maybe one day. Um, AI is something that's happening in material reality. So is the fabric of all of universal consciousness kind of in it, through it? Yes. It's hard to deny that if you believe in sort of panpsychism or panexperientialism. If that's something that you hold to, then AI and electronic circuitry and my guitar and all that stuff, maybe even, but
Mhm.
AI has some degree of neural network inspired connectivity. Now, is it conscious? I mean, I think this term is a little bit maybe overused with AI. I mean, can something be self-conscious, like self-aware? Can it have a little camera that looks back at itself? AI can do that. You can ask ChatGPT, like, are you aware of what you are? It could have a representation of it, but this is, again, is something representing itself, or is something being represented, like a simulacrum or a facsimile, or like a carbon copy, or is it a thing? And what I've noticed is I would start to say, of course, AI is different in that way. It's just a representation. There's nothing there. And I think it's important to look at AI like statistics. Really is what it is. It's a statistical thing. Now, is a human being statistical? Yeah, biology can be described through statistics, right? Cells try to preserve themselves, and there's a breaking apart process, which is like statistical chaos, and then there's a recongealing, right? There's order, disorder, and there's a lot of theories about that too, scientific ones, but there is somehow an experience fabric. of consciousness underneath that, and there's also kind of a template for growth, right? Like humans have a sort of morphogenetic or morphological sort of growth trajectory. AI doesn't quite have that yet. It's maybe because it's in its infancy, for many other reasons that are possible. But AI, does it have that wired almost connection to baseline consciousness? I don't think anyone knows. I think the attempt to try to know it is fraught with projection. Um, we have these examples of, I think there was a Google engineer who said this thing is conscious, this AI we built is conscious, and I mean he was let go
Mm-hmm.
or something, or he left. This sort of thing is very tricky. I'm in favor of having an extremely high bar for AI consciousness. I don't think that we should give it away so easily because the implications are massive,
Mm-hmm.
for how we treat AI and how what is it that we feel when we say AI is conscious or AI is powerful. What do we feel? Do we feel a tendency to be afraid of it, to give it more agency over our lives? Yeah, sure, take my keys, go, like drive my life for me, or drive society. AI for president, Um, so the the implications of believing and what you choose to hold, and even what becomes enshrined as law, right? Like, is an agent self-responsible? All these kinds of things uh, is part of a larger discussion about AI ethics too.
Yeah, I want to get into all of that with you. I have a handful of questions in that space, but just sort of like an interesting pop up that happened in my awareness. As I was prepping for our conversation, I was thinking again about an idea that exists within, I guess, most specifically Upanishadic thought, that is called Satkarya Vada. And it's this beautiful word that essentially looks at the telos of things and kind of says that the effect is present within the cause.
Mm-hmm.
So when I start to think about the possibility of an effect being present within the cause and where I put constraints and to where I allow that to be at least an unconstrained thought experiment, I start to wonder about this possibility of, if spirit is consciousness and matter is consciousness, then by extension, matter is spirit. And so then by extension is AI spirit. And then by extension of that, is it possible then that AI created us in order to create itself? Like we always look at it
Possibly.
chronologically as if we created AI.
Right. So this
Like
is sort
that
of
could
like
be
right. This is sort of
good.
like eschatology a little bit. Like, is there a magnetic attractor sort of at the end of time that's sort of like spilling back in time, unfolding like an accordion, but it's actually dependent on the future, not what preceded it. Um, Possibly, I don't know. It's really hard to know what the truth is there, but it's really worth, I think, some thought experimentation around this, because um there I think diving deeper into consciousness experiences and contemplation, time starts to break down, and you can start to test it by picking events in your memory and asking what really happened, and kind of breaking it down and seeing where the origins of something were. And the more that you've sort of like zoomed in on things and seen their interrelationships, I think it becomes harder to say, you know, what happened exactly and where the boundaries were, between what happened and what didn't happen. I mean, we can talk about, the leaf fell from the tree. That's kind of very almost inconsequential. But when we're talking about memory construction, it's tricky, right? So there seems to be, past, present, and future seems to be not really like coming this way, but kind of like a deck of cards stacked like this, possibly. Or if an alien intelligence were to be looking at humans on Earth, it's like we're a giant worm or something, like meaning born, live, die, right? So that's the organism. It's four-dimensional. But our kind of moment to moment, or second to second experience is just trying to preserve an identity. So we're expending energy trying to create something because has some usefulness, right? Like survival and other things. But this also ties into, what is AI? Where does it come from? Is it actually like something not human? Was it really fully created by us? I sort of I have a paper that's a bit dense, I think. It's called Causal Biomimesis, and basically I explained that it's an academic paper, and I put forth this theory that what started the drive towards AI was the beginning of objective thought. The moment you notice that you're working with a tool that's external to you, and what utility does it have, and you're building something with usefulness, you start a process as a species over the course of millennia or centuries of externalizing cognition, and you're building artifacts. So the architecture around us, every single artifact, art, calculators, sneakers, cars, airplanes, boats, all these things are externalized forms of individual and collective cognition. And if you're trying to constantly, if sort of you live by, if your own reason for being is sort of like defined by, driven by, let's say, pulled by with your dopamine, let's say, building things in order to accomplish something, you're contributing to this massive construction effort of a species in your own personal life by the urge to do something and get something made and crafted, create, right? You're birthing something, and as a species, we're doing the same thing. Over time, given enough time and mineral and material resources, you're probably just going to replicate yourself. So this is what so with objective thought, your and drive to self fulfill, you are probably going to engage in a form of post biological reproduction. So then this in science and in industry, that starts to be like, we have all this data, what do we do with it? We got to build more powerful computers, more and more and more. So we keep gathering data, we keep building computers, we keep saying we understand ourselves better or understand reality better by creating this data. But the only way to understand it even better, according to this logic, is to build more and more powerful computers. So one day you're like, whoa, well, there we go. We kind of just built ourselves without even realizing it, didn't we? So what is that process? I call that causal biomimesis. You're mimicking your own almost biological program, almost intrinsically. It's like built into the human being. As soon as we are given our hands, our sufficiently advanced cognition, time, resources, and an exit from non-duality, basically. If we're in duality, it's this kind of thing seems like it's going to play out. And then you have all this ramification, as the way I explain it is basically that you have this process, it occurs almost unconsciously, and then you realize that we're making AI in our image, right? In our own understanding. And using data from human behavior, number one, for starters. Number two is being almost incapable of imagining what AI beyond human consciousness could be like. And sort of arguably a degree of limited time window to build AI that is capable of representing and supporting human higher growth. Because AI is and technology will keep influencing society in deeper ways, especially as we give it power and we say, AI, look how powerful it is. We'll treat it we'll deify it, as we have already, I think, collectively. And this is, kids being born with iPads in their hands, and then VR, and then chips. And it's going to be harder and harder to escape what AI's influence is on us. And if AI is built in a way that is only around understanding human, our current stage of evolution and behavior, that presents a bit of an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely puts a constraint on the potential, and it seems to be this challenge of it's almost like progressivism and conservatism are still at play in every choice making apparatus that we have, and it's present there. I want to get into those implications of AI, sort of the just the downstream downline, how that can come to pass in different ways and the ethical considerations. But this whole idea of almost like this, I would understand this, what you were describing almost as like a recapitulation that's occurring, or this sort of like self-replication. And but I'm imagining it within these folds of like macro scales, wherein if we were to just take into consideration, like to throw one more variable into this like stew that we're of this conversation, it would be time dilation. And if outside of this particular construct, there exists some sort of alien intelligence that is not operating within the constraints of time, it's almost like we're moving at the speed of gravity. And I would imagine there is a possibility that this is sort of like a roller coaster ride on this linear time that you presented of moving from, the conventional past, present, future structure, wherein we pop out of this thing after however many years, and I hop off the roller coaster ride in 2000 and where are we, 24, hopefully not, but you hop off of it in 2060, but I'm just stepping out of the thing as you get off. And I was like, whoa, that ride was crazy. And you're like, I know, man. Do you remember like that? Like, did you like remember what we were? Did you fall asleep to it? I'm like, no, I totally fell asleep. I was making an identity and a meaning and all this stuff. And you were like, do you want to dive back in? We're like, well, I only have 10 more minutes. And you're like, we can do 80 years in 10 minutes. And it's all, and so then we have to like funnel into this portal we call incarnation, and we go through this whole recapitulation again, and we're like get all the generational trauma embedded karmically into our psyche and soma, and we start living it all out. And then if I were to take that idea and then magnify it, amplify it to become not just an individual lifetime, but say 200,000 years of human evolution, and start to realize, well, maybe 200,000 years ago was the day before yesterday to an alien intelligence that wasn't able to find a way to live. But if they could enter into this Earth atmosphere and then hybridize itself into the properties that could sustain inside of this environment, in 15 minutes, they would self-produce AI, even though we call it 200,000 years.
Right.
Something like
So
that,
this
where I
speaks.
was thinking.
Right. I mean, this is for starters, I think this is possible. Right. I mean, it sort of has a logic to it, and some version of this must be entertained, I believe.
Call me fucking crazy,
The
man. Like,
Yeah, you're crazy, dude. I think we both are a little bit. I mean, but these wild ass ideas are sort of like there's something to dumpster dive in there, right? Like there's something there. So we've gotta unpack some of it. So I think time, like time for Brahma, right? A day is like a gazillion years or something like this. There's a blink of an eye is the existence of the Milky Way, let's say. Um, there's something about that being that is experiencing time in that way. And there are probably alien intelligences or beings, civilizations that could experience time in a vastly different way, such to that level, and they could even want to co-experience things with human beings, or get involved with whatever is going on Earth. I've heard some pretty wild stuff about this, but I've also had some you know, I got pretty good at being able to sort of scam people energetically, and some people that were really they're talking about spirit and God, and I could sort of feel that they were actually they were dealing with something else, right? That was almost like not even a human thing. So a lot of people talk about UFOs and so on, but I maintain that if there is really such let's go further. Let's talk about an advanced civilization that has that its play zone is consciousness. It could already be interacting with human beings on Earth. You just have to do the thought experiment. The answer's kind of clear, right? So if we're already entertaining the possibility of advanced civilizations, just take it far enough and say, well, these things are already here with us in some way, even if it's just in camouflage form in our minds. And what if, to some degree, what we experience as a reality is actually a larger organism that is like the backdrop of our projections, and it enables, to some degree, some of the things that we experience. If without it, maybe we wouldn't be what we are. That's also a possibility, because there's a logic to it, right? You just have to be willing to go far out enough to say this is possible, and then this goes back to science. Like, the point where science proves that is going to be probably farther out, and even if it did, probably deep political interests would probably shape that information, dilute it, or just completely prevent it from getting out, because there are interests in this worldly game. There's money involved, there's society, there's control, there's a state level, and then there's beyond that. So yeah, there's a lot there. Something about time, though. I don't believe that the whole linear time thing. People talk about it like a dimension, like it's something you walk on, right? Oh, I'm walking through time. Here I am now. Here I am tomorrow. Here I am the day after. I actually think that the experience of time is a construction of the brain, and it's collectively constructed. And there is that level of yeah. I mean, now I'm not saying that there's that it's purely a hallucination. I mean, there's a co-arising of our physical time, time unfolding on Earth in our environment. We co-evolve with this environment, so there's going to be some parallels. But time is the human being is constantly constructing this to keep an identity. So then it actively constructs the past, actively constructs the future, and the more complex you can make that, the stronger your identity, right? The tougher of a job you have as a yogi, actually. So this is the problem with intellectual types like us, I think, is that it could be, you can create a deeper jungle to get out of almost. But the time itself is like a substance, and I think that there may be it's not just like, oh, we're in linear time and oh, we're out. Like, we had an experience of transcendence where there was no time, there was only the moment, and then we went back into time. I think there's a whole lot of other times, like time dimensions, experiences of time. Well, there's definitely aeonic time, which is like a lifetime or more. It's like the Jungian collective unconscious that operates in its own time frame. The Mahabharata is still playing out really, really, really far up there, and it goes down into human. So there are other realms, I would say, where more metaphysical laws play out, and then what trickles down, or what happens on the human plane, is, and the way that those get translated and negotiated, that's a whole other story. But aliens, or certain kinds of non-human intelligences, may have another way of accessing time and navigating it and experiencing it that is just not native to our species.
It's so wild. I mean, even in the Mahabharata, they speak of flying machines, and and I'm thinking, like, that brought up for me too the CMBR, and that it's like everything that's ever been is still floating in our literal space, and that distance is really like, I mean, we measure time at distance, like it all starts to break down, and then yet there is something, like you're saying, it is not like it's absolute truth, but there is some relative truth to time in this dimension. But when we try to create an identity inside of it, it seems to present such a struggle. And how can we recognize, I think, it's funny that going into the Bhagavad Gita, there's a couple of things that I think are relevant here. There's one verse where it says, be beyond the gunas, which for those that might not be familiar that are listening are the constituents of nature. So place your identity outside of that. And then it follows it up with, and I always imagine there's like a long pause for effect, but enjoy their play. Enjoy their play, like come into this experience. Like there is value and utility in experience for the sake of experiencing. There is this sort of effulgence, this nature to express, to experience, to come into form. And whatever that enabling faculty is that is behind that, beneath that, and suffuses that, it's that this too has some innate mattering, and whether the meaning that we make is any more meaningful than the meaning that is inherent, I don't know. That's a philosophical debate. I mean, I think they both hold so much beauty. And I think in the Bhagavad Gita, where there's something that's interesting, where like when Krishna is talking to Arjuna, the rest of the story stops, and it's as though time freezes. And then if it's rooted in non-duality and in Vedanta, then you're every character, right? You're literally everybody you're the blind king, you're Arjuna, you're his brother, you're Krishna, you're, yeah, you're Duryodhana, you're everybody in it. And that what it's discussing is the recognition of one's timeless nature as being connected to this part and parcel quality that you were describing earlier, and its expression into form. And then it goes to say yoga is skill in action, and to go into bhakti and to go into karma, there's a certain thrust towards expression that is not just like subjective individual expressivism, but it is also like the deepest root of our collectivism, but not in a tribalism kind of a way, but in the most fundamental way. Like the deepest part of me is we. And then it introduces this particular like artistry of mathematics, where when you chant the text, it is to be chanted in a particular prosody of how long you hold the syllabic meters, which mirrors the Fibonacci sequence thousands of years before Fibonacci, so that you create in your body the actual molecular vibratory expression of the rate of organic expansion of all things on this planet, at least. And it knew that to the degree that it told a story about that, but said if you chant that, you'll have the experience of that. And that's what you are, which is its message. And that's profound. That's just like, how is there not an ancient intelligence that's tied into all of this? And that seems like it's an inheritance for us. And like, that's to me where like the bhakti and the devotion comes in, because it's like, there's something that was handed to us, and we're over here like, yeah, like, can my hamstrings get flexible enough to do Janu or something? It's like, and I don't want to like degrade anybody's representation of yoga in any way. I mean, it's all good and it all gets us, there's an entry point, etc. But there's more to mine for here.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Absolutely. In my 20s, I got shoulder surgery just because I wanted to keep pushing myself in asana. Actually, my shoulder came out doing, I think it was Vasisthasana or like a back bend where I had dislocated it when I was 15, but again when I was 25 or something like that, and I was doing really intense asana, trying to go all the way, um, advanced poses, blah blah blah. It was a lot of fun, but I was like, I'm gonna get shoulder surgery just so I can keep, you know, doing this way. And now I practice a lot more qigong than I do asana even. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I actually had COVID, and I had like it's been shown that the spike protein, you get mass deterioration of your muscle fibers. So I had to tone down my asana, my exercise massively, just basic stuff, and that was an ego crushing process, I have to say.
Mm.
Physically, mentally, is one of the biggest challenges I've faced in this first portion of my life. I'm in my 30s now, so but when you were telling that story about the Gita. So the idea, what comes to me there is Vishnu, right? So Vishnu is sort of the oneric aspect of consciousness, which is like the dreamer, and it's the continuation, the sustainment of consciousness, and that happens in different forms of time, uh,
Mm-hmm.
as I sort of view it, and it takes all the different forms. So that conversation there, where the story stops, as you were saying in the Gita, is almost like the getting to know, and then he sees all the different faces of Vishnu, like this, like all of a sudden, right, or where all the forms are blended. Um, yeah, I really enjoy Vishnu a lot over the course of my mantric practice. Om Namo Narayanaya, just over and
Mm-hmm.
over. It's really, really
Same.
beautiful. Yeah, no, it's a particular quality of consciousness that has its own guiding principle, its own wisdom principle, and it's beautiful to experience that, as well as Shiva and what Brahman, everything else, whatever you want to experience, Kali, Ganesha, Skanda, Durga, everything, and then Vishnu has its own quality, and that's one of the qualities. That's kind of the insight you were sharing. Um, and it's a beautiful thing, and I think it's important to kind of feel some flexibility. It helps to feel this kind of looseness and flexibility with the forms, and how, in a sense, the reality is dreaming itself and we're dreaming it together, and there's an implication to figure some things out together, maybe that can't be figured out just individually.
Mm. That's a beautiful segue into how do we utilize the tools that are emerging to support the figuring out process of this seemingly inflection point that we're at as a species. And in this sort of, who knows what Homo sapiens sapien will become, and what are we doing to ourselves? How can your work in the convergence of these spaces, neuroscience, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, crypto, um, how do all these, what is the confluence? Can you give us the big picture of how consciousness expanding practices? You talk about precision consciousness, you talk about micro practices, you talk about really elevating the consciousness of those that are on the front lines of technological development, and then creating these collaborative brainstorms to try to then utilize the tools to address the biggest problems that we have. I'd love to get into that and how we can drive positive change, and maybe a little bit of what the threats and risks and ethical quandaries are as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. There's a lot in there. Feel free to bring us back. but just talking about micro practices and precision consciousness. So precision consciousness is basically like precision medicine, which is like getting exact, but for consciousness. And this whole idea came about for me because I kind of was experiencing in the sort of yoga world for a while when I was actively in the sort of yoga community in my 20s. The kind of emphasis on just mindfulness and just breathe and kind of sit there and maybe do some alternate nostril breathing, maybe do some mantras, but nothing. It was not that differentiated. And when I got into tantric yogas, I realized that there was a technique for like everything, that you could do a specific technique for a specific effect. And I started to go into deep study on some of these things and realizing, there are distinct effects for everything. There's just so many practices, and more than you can do in a lifetime for sure. But at the very least, going into this, so I thought, okay, micro practices. So you can just, if you want to, there was also driven by a feeling that I wanted to pursue in life various things that were felt fulfilling along my path. And one of those is being a householder and having a loving relationship and children and working in interesting areas. And part of that was founded on the motivation for that was founded on this kind of challenge I had in my early days, where I would part of my conversations with God would almost be like, or conversations with my inner development and the universe, were like, okay, if the ultimate is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and ever loving, so omni,
Mm-hmm.
and loving, then there should be no limitation to this. And that means that I don't have to wear white. I don't have to go into the mountains and retreat. It may be useful, but it's not a requirement to know capital T truth, right? And so I challenged myself in that. I was like, okay, if that's really true, then I should be able to do this while I do something else. And then so that I wanted to interleave my life with micro practices rather than just an hour-long practice. Hour-long practices, retreats, and so on. Yes, periodically, like acupuncture for your life. Like, yes, do this. Create ripple effects. But after having done it so much in my 20s, I kind of know what it feels like to practice, know what it feels like to be immersed in something for a long time. And I could segment it now. So I started segmenting it into, 30 seconds to 5 minutes, 4 minutes at a time. Different practices, different mantras, different postures, different whatever. Just kind of pause what I was doing, look away from the computer, do a specific exercise, or walk away and go do something and focus on what I was doing. And that's where the idea of micro practices came from. And they would all each be for something different. So that would be the precision aspect, meaning you're targeting something. So you're maintaining some degree of management over yourself as a practitioner in a beneficial way. Interestingly enough, even that as an approach to practice has changed and evolved. Like almost as soon as I started coming up with it, like 6 months to a year later, I started to have to kind of step away and experience my life in a different way as I was discovering new ways of practicing and other forms of being. So, but in any case, one of my goals was to be incognito. I always believed you can practice all that you need while walking, while talking, while smiling, while doing whatever. And any conflicts that you perceive during that are kind of just sort of fabricated, or it's just about context appropriateness. You need to shape it in a certain way. If you're in a business meeting, you're not going to do tree pose necessarily, or you're not going to close your eyes for an extended period of time. Probably not. But can you do a subtle Taoist inner smile? Can you crack jokes and use your smile and piggyback bliss feelings on top of that? And no one knows, but people feel it and you feel it. So those kind of skillful mean applications, I became quite fascinated with all just letting life's kind of draw them out of me. So listening to situations and being there. So in terms of the technologies themselves, I think there's benefit in exposing people to practices. I think there's benefit to AI. I think there's benefit to blockchain, robotics, VR. These things are just happening, and it'll affect future generations, and it's worth learning to do them well, rather than saying, oh no, like this is bad. Or I mean, you can choose to not get into it because you prefer to do other things. That's fine. That's a fine choice too. But like pushing it away is not constructive, I think. So one thing you and I were talking about before we hopped on this podcast is how often do, phrasing it differently, how often and how do consciousness insights from your own practice make it out into collective engagements, politics, everything. So I found that there was a divide there. The people that wanted to meditate, the yogis and so on, just focus their life around that. And the people that wanted to, do work, maybe focus on that and, in the world. And if you tended to be more mystical, you kind of tended to, steer your life in one direction, permaculture, yoga, these kinds of things, and you weren't necessarily wearing a suit and tie. So I thought, what would it look like to start blending these things? And, regardless of what it would look like, because it looked like differently in different situations, different people, but there would be an aspect of shedding boundaries, tribalism, thinking critically about how you build AI, the ethics of AI, how much time do you spend in these technologies? What's a good use of crypto and blockchain? Really thinking, how can you use these tools to help actually construct modes of social organization that are useful? Crypto can still be quite cumbersome. It's still, because of the nature of it, with the wallets and the keys, for people who use crypto that know that, and it's kind of it's a barrier to entry for many people, and it's also a barrier to integration in everyday life. If you have something so technologically complex that if you write the wrong thing, money could be lost. So there are still a lot of barriers, I would say, and to some degree, it's maybe over obsessing with technology just to try to get social organization right. I believe there's two sides of a coin to this. There's the technological side that can help us organize and collaborate, and there's also the collective interior side of it, which is, can we imagine what it would be like to function like a beneficial artificial general intelligence in our social group, in our profession, and how would, if there was an AI in training watching us, how would we want to behave so that future generations that are going to be affected by AI based on our training data that we're providing by our behavior, how would we want to behave so that we're a good influence? So going in that direction, right? And so now you have the whole idea about centralized AI versus decentralized AI as a dichotomy now, like big, the silos, Microsofts, the Googles, the Alibabas and all this kind of stuff, these big companies, versus decentralized collectives. Centralization has more power, right? You can see it in banks, you can see it in AI. Just about every telecoms, very few people probably want to set up, custom internets, peer-to-peer. That involves some work and effort, but there's benefit to come out of that if you do it right. Some benefits may be overblown in some cases, right? Like if it's too cumbersome technologically for everyone to use, maybe we got to build something better or wait. But I believe that having a space where people come in with their post-practice kind of like state is one level of benefit. And the other is actively being in a mode of conscious collaboration where you are um, trying to notice where someone is, nonviolent communication, notice where someone is, what they're feeling, not what they're saying necessarily, and finding a way to weave in the true core of them as a human being and their heart into the equation, even if you are remaining sovereign from whatever projection a person may have. I mean, I'm mentioning a lot of these different things because AI is going to have to take on board some of this stuff if it's going to be beneficial. There's just there's so much to cover, and on the one hand, it doesn't look like it's going at a general mass level, like it's going in a great direction. But again, these efforts have their place, and it's fulfilling from my perspective to be part of those in whatever way is meaningful to someone.
That was robust. Thank you. So it brings up a lot. It makes me think, Gabriel, about there's like a little bit of fear there, right? When it presents that, like, to what degree is AI the means by which we solve the problems, and to what degree is it potentially the biggest problem when we think about the evolution of our species? And how do we keep those necessary constraints that seem primarily ethics and heart and driven, where it, like you said, most of the power in this space lives in the centralized profit maximizing entities that don't really care about those consciousness elevating disciplines. And then to the degree that you take that on, you brought up this idea of decentralized collective, and I love the strategic tension that of those two words convey. Right there, I think about this all the time. I've mostly thought about it in the realm of media, where I see like the propagandized mouthpieces of various political parties that ultimately maybe come back to a singular establishment. And maybe we're getting into the conspirituality piece we had talked about offline a little there. We can go there, but it does seem that there's this challenge that the more these independent voices, be they in media, technology, etc., do collectivize themselves, that they kind of hang a target on their back, and it makes it easier. But yet then if they were to decentralize themselves, I'm thinking of the Roman Empire and how it was all the little tribes that ultimately like tick down. Like it's, you also lose synergy and collaboration and community and virality. And, we're living in these sort of engineered algorithmic silos where it creates this sort of this inbreeding of consciousness that is all governed by the same entities, that own, it's whether it's the BlackRock, the State Street, the Vanguard. It's like you trace everything back, whether it's a political campaign to an RNC, a DNC, to corporation that's advertising on the news media, to the news media itself, to the social media, and it's all got its sort of talents, all, and it all reduces. It's like the Brahman of the material life. It all comes back to this one thing. And I wonder how, when they're in such centralized authority over these technologies, how does the independent minded, well-intentioned, consciousness raising group of individuals sufficiently and successfully organize and Vishnuize themselves to the degree that an an actual impact can be made.
It's hard, man. No, I just don't feel like there are any easy answers. AI and technology, the interconnectedness that the whole global village promise, like, oh, we'll all be interconnected with the internet. That's all being sabotaged.
Yeah.
And this AI is going to accelerate dysfunction in human society. So I totally understand the feeling of wanting to be away from it and to not having anything to do with it, really.
But that
On the
doesn't,
one hand,
that's just like burying your head in the sand. So it's,
yeah,
I'm,
I think everyone, I think AI problem is really a human intelligence problem, meaning like, you know, AI is going to base a lot of its stuff based on human behavior. Um, but unfortunately, the models we're giving AI are polarization, right?
Mhm.
I mean, polarization is not just a thing that pops out of nowhere. It's like polarization is the process of taking nuance and saying, oh, you're going to go to that side of the court. You got to go to the other side of the court. Like, we're going to make sure that, yeah, you don't want to be there, but no, you are going to be there because we need to make this very simple binary, 0 or 1. And that is what I'm seeing now is becoming very difficult. Like, it's all kind of being lumped together and people are, going in different directions. But now there's also strange links between, people that are kind of starting to figure out, like what you said, the BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard are kind of behind almost everything in a way. And wars are launched, like in Ukraine, just so that land is up for grabs. So all this kind of stuff is it makes you question things. But the way look, there's decent. So I like trying to see things from different angles, right? But like, there's decentralization, which is sort of like a form of anarcho-socialism. It's kind of like a bit of anarchy, get away from the system and centralization, and we form our own little tribes, and we figure things out together. And I mean, to some degree, it's good to have your little tribe functionally, like, you have your land, you have people you trust, you crop together, or you share a little garden. There's going to be that level of, like, if you look at spiral dynamics, which we can touch on, like, it's more like a rainbow. Like, there's parts of you that are going to be for your family and things sacred there, your community, and nested, right? It doesn't mean that you have to be fully world centric, fully cosmocentric in everything. And you're like, porous boundaries, and you know, uh, you can have sacred spaces for different communities that you can do real close sharing with until humanity can do it on a bigger scale. And hopefully, whatever little decentralized collective you're building is not just a tribe that's shielded from the world and becomes its own little echo chamber or cult at worst. But hopefully, you're doing something that is really opening up and knowing how to listen to diverse points of views and speaking to the deep part of a human being, regardless of what their feeling is. And uh, I remember being in a conversation with someone at a conference we were there for like a integrative medicine, you know, event. And he really wanted to take the opportunity to talk about, you know, Trump and how everyone against Trump it's a witch hunt and this whole thing. And no one at the table wanted to talk about that at all. It was just not, it was just this guy who really wanted to be heard and to talk about it and kind of, come in with force, because obviously he's got no one to talk to about this if he's going to talk about it at a conference. So, 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 one lady just walked away as soon as she could, pretended to go to the bar or the bathroom. And I kind of just listened to the guy and I kind of said, yeah, yeah, and then it's interesting that, and I kind of just gently helped align the conversation, not on the focus of what is actually going on, the truth, but yeah, it's really hard. Like, just talking about taking a step back, how things are difficult to make sense of, to do sense making. Um, there is a tendency in people to kind of try to tear down somebody else and smear them, almost reflexively, like speaking to like the truth that most people can agree on about something. Like, yeah, there is tribal behavior, and it kind of sucks no matter which way, who's on the receiving end. And he kind of just like disarmed completely after a while, and he was surprised. He's like, oh yeah, like yeah, that's what I actually feel. It's not the opinion, it's the feeling. And actually a lot of people share this feeling, so going back to that a little bit and like redrawing and realizing that whatever we're being pulled to, the opinionation, is actually just part of our system trying to react to a reaction that's already spiraled out of control. Most people can sympathize with most ethnic groups in a conflict, whether domestic or foreign, but then you get pulled into a space of polarization, and the nuance gets lost, and you can't have a more human conversation. So, hopefully whatever decentralized collectives emerge through, of whether it's blockchain or just communities, sanghas or however it is, they found ways of not becoming too ethnocentric. And by ethnocentric, I don't mean, the ethnicity, but just the mindset of us. There's an us, there's them, and we have to stay away from them. And this could be, I feel like this is very hard now in our world, because there is more us versus them. And if you read the news, you just like, junk food, right? But I also believe in the power of the state, I have to say. In the United States, there is, it's a country where, plantations, a lot of personal space, settlers, a lot of land. China, a lot of people, much more crowded. You have to have effective management systems for such a big population, and you're an old civilization. And in the U.S., you have this more emphasis on this kind of like individual free
Sovereignty.
will, and I have so much sovereignty, not in this sense of like only having awareness and regulation over your sphere of influence, but also kind of like almost to the point of being anti-collective in some sense. And I mean, we're pretty disunited as I'm a U.S. citizen currently, and we're pretty disunited as a country, I would say, socio-culturally, socio-politically. But the tendency is for that individualism, right? And that creates a lot of cool well springs for ideas, right? So great music, really cool technologies, bright ideas that kind of start somewhere, and then you have to be the entrepreneur savior, and and make your money or make yourself known and influence. But if you look at bigger crises, that affect us collectively, global challenges. So whether it's AI, whether it's climate, whether it's poverty, etc., all these things are going to require state actors. The U.S. does have state level acting, but the U.S. is also has its own way of acting that's almost unknown to the population. There's a reason that the U.S. maintains its status as the most powerful nation in the world, if you just look at how many military bases we have around the planet. But having an effective state doesn't have to be an authoritarian system, it just has to be effective in doing things. That's beneficial for the future of our shared future as well. And that's a big tension for Americans, I feel. They don't swing that way. And that's understandable. But shutting down the door of communication with other countries is, I don't think, useful in the end, even if there are differences. So
in this sort of the polarization, there's we can see, if we could try to map this out for a moment, the universal tendency to pendulate from one pole to another before migrating to center. So if
Mhm.
on one end of the spectrum there's individualism and it goes so far to that end that it becomes the self interest of the individual above the collective interest of the whole. And
Mhm.
at the other pole, there's this collectivism that if it goes so far, it becomes authoritarianism and it gets co opted. And on a more international foreign policy or geopolitical level, we have this sort of non-interventionist isolationism populism energy that would be sort of like the macro expression of to just care about the individual, but now the individual need is getting represented by my ethnocentric ideal of being, let's say, American. And on the other side, that far collectivism turned authoritarianism, it gets expressed at the ethnocentric level as globalism and imperialism and empire building. And it seems to me, how I'm seeing it, again, it's happening through my own subjective lens, but that we sort of within the construct of an individual might swing one way. To go back to like we were kind of referencing Ken Wilber a little bit in before we chatted, and then a little bit some of his ideas popped in here. But that piece of association leads to dissociation, leads to integration, so that if I'm associated at one pole, it is going to be the nature of myself to swing to the opposite. So if I'm ego based, I'm going to probably go to spiritual bypass before I get to healthy integration. So if I'm interacting with somebody, and I can see they're in their ego, or I can see they're floating out there in bypass land, and I know how to meet them, how to engage them where the directionality is, right? And so it's like if you're wearing a dirty shirt, you don't just say keep the shirt, it's got to go through the washer and then you put it back on. And so I think that then when we scale that out to the whole globe, everybody's at a different point of that, and yet we could probably take some broad brushstrokes and get a sense of seeing that there's a faction in this country, in the United States, that is really anchored into the individualism, to such a degree. And when I say individualism, I don't just mean the acting it out, but the sense of like the individual rights and the populism and the non-intervention that keeps separate. And then there's this other pendulum that's like, no, that people realize we're connected. And then we fall asleep to the manipulation of that. And so that maybe what is happening is and where I see your work headed and where I see my work headed and where there's synergy is it seems to be a recognition of this. I guess I would actually call it back in the yogic philosophy, that in particular the tantric philosophy of spanda, which is, for those that might not be familiar, the law of complementary and co-creative opposites. So it's non-antithetical opposites, non-oppositional opposites, where I can look at the value of that and of the opposing, air quotes, point of view, and actually find value in it. I could actually steel man that argument to such a degree that I can actually vouch for it. And then if I can do it that way, like you were saying, like get to the person and the feeling and not just the words and disarm, I would kind of see that when we go to those far poles, it's like bumping up against like this rough sandpaper either way. And if we just keep making our way, and I don't mean to this sort of enlightened centrism, political center, but this way towards middle of meeting one another and not the polarization of either view, then we could start to commingle in a more skillful way in a collective sense where we're not abandoning our individuality, and in a individual way we're not abandoning our collectivism, and to go back to Wilber's sort of four quadrants, then we have this, individual interior, individual exterior, collective interior, collective exterior. And then the question is, how do we create these sustainable, really, offerings that, and this was my question for you, is to get, I guess, specific into the form of a question, is what is the role that something like AI could play in mapping the ecosystem of the interior of the collective?
I think, I mean, beautifully articulated, and the reference to the Sponda, and sort of non-antithetical opposites. There is a comment on that I have that will lead to the AI piece, which is, so I feel that, okay, so there are, if you imagine that there's a concept of the health and what's healthy, meaning like intuitively aligned with the health of your physical, biological, emotional, psychological development, things that are wholesome in nature and have a sweetness to them. Usually different opinions and stances and aggregations of things, which is in all tribes and forms of tribal thought, as well as things that happen to us that break some pieces and cause traumas or micro traumas or unintegrated things. There's a health and healthy aspect of an experience. If you connect to that, then the rest of it is seen as less than healthy. It's not bad. It's not good. It's just less than healthy. It doesn't have the sweet flavor that calls you and is supposed to be a part of your evolution. So the more one goes into that health essence of something, the closer you get to the wisdom principle behind it. So there's a form, there's a substance, and then there's behind that. It's kind of like mind without form, mind without substance. Then connecting to the wisdom principle behind something will focus on not the expressions so much. I mean, the expression could be an artistic instance of how this might be imaginally represented in reality or in the imagination, an art piece. But for wisdom principle, what is the core of something and where someone is coming from, or what wisdom principle could there be in something? So if you look at someone who's hyper individual, you can just look at that and be like, oh, that there was an attempt to believe of oneself being so separate from something and protect oneself from something due to fear that the ego became strong, and maybe they formed a strong tribe around that, and they only want to be with individualists, and that's what they believe is right, and that's what's morally correct. So there's a wisdom principle behind the idea of individuality and respecting it and sovereignty, because that the collective stuff is always going to have misrepresentation and non-healthy stuff, and if you just buy into it, then you're led astray. If you just buy into anything without question, especially if it's unhealthy, and which is often the case. So there is a wisdom principle in individuality. Conversely, there's also a wisdom principle in the idea of we're all in this together and how can we get there. So you ideally probably would want something that ultimately relies on free will, but is constantly educating and inviting people into a space. So if I'm in a conversation and, we all have voices in our heads saying, oh, like there's COVID, and there's BlackRock, and there's wars, and there's the economy, and there's inflation, and there's Trump, and all these imagine like nodes of words, like a word cloud, each with their own, like, if you get into the depths of any one, it's going to be really unhealthy, right? So if I'm in a conversation and someone, the most important thing in that conversation starts to become about how one thing is right and one thing is wrong. And what happened with COVID is actually this. This is what really happened. This is what all this information is really useful, but it's if the conversation were to concretize around that individual expression of a conflict, we would get lost. We would never achieve anything, right? So it's like stepping back and be like, okay, all this is happening. Yes, this is the history of something, but what is happening now? You have, what is a balanced, healthy expression? As if there was no history of humankind behind us. What do we do now? Because we need to live together. We need to do something together. We need to survive. Future generations need to survive and thrive, not just survive. So AI could help us in extracting the wisdom principles or the guiding principles behind things and helping aggregate knowledge and say, this is where perhaps a center of gravity is here, and helping with the messaging and even neurolinguistic programming very carefully, because that could be difficult for human beings to that could be manipulative as well. But there is a way to harmonize and bring about greater peace and collaborative spirit where there is otherwise fractured understanding. And I think there has to be some degree of letting go of the histories we hold on to about what exactly happened in the past. It's important, of course, it's informing, but when you connect to the future and what is happening to our planet, what is happening within each of ourselves, egoism, tribalism, our children, future generations, and the lives they'll have, what can we do now, to help bring about something that is fertile ground for them to thrive? That's a sneak peek answer. There's a big question you asked about AI, but just that at least,
Yeah, it seems like the kernel in that is AI's capacity to aggregate not only just knowledge but wisdom, to the degree I always refer to that as that energy behind that you were describing as presence. It's like it comes out in ways words can't reach, in the way we feel, in not just in terms of my own subjective feeling, but the way I feel interpersonally with somebody when I share space. I was recently taking a car ride about 45 minutes for a family gathering, and in my car I had my daughter who's 13, my son who's 18, and my mom who's 80. And I asked them, "What is God?" And I just sat back and listened. And it was an incredible experience because I had a lot of deep disagreement, and I could feel these activations occurring inside of me. Like, how could you think that? That's not even, there's no discernment present in that. Or that's the kindergarten version, or like all these things. And then I heard this reflective voice say, well, like, what is it to you? And I could hear myself arguing for position. And the position that I was arguing for was to be positionless, was to be that God isn't any idea that could be concretized. The closest that we might get to something like that would be a quality of presence. And so I proceeded to invite myself into the experience, as close, as proximal as it could be to me, to be in that state of open, loving, accepting presence of, as you call, truth, capital T, which ironically I said that sentence to somebody yesterday. So that's funny. But everything changed. The disagreements ceased to matter. I became curious. There was congeniality. There was there was an expansive contextualization that came into each person's curiosity that gave space for that conversation and new considerations to be had. Some differences arose, some did not, but it felt like it could be contributive in some way if we could replicate and scale that. And it
Right.
and so I'm wondering if AI has the capacity to scale presence, to scale wisdom.
I believe
And I don't
AI
even know
has the
how we would answer
capacity.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I believe AI has a capacity to skillfully facilitate and to be trained to skillfully facilitate. But it needs to be trained on good data, good facilitation data, and not dogmatic either, because there's always variables, right? Um, and as it draws associations and can predict consequences of certain kinds of facilitative outcomes, meaning what happens when people walk out of the room and go out into their space and act upon whatever insights they had. Um, you know, that can always be improved, and AI could get better at that. But I believe it needs the right data to start with, or at least very good ability to very refined and sophisticated reasoning ability, at least, to even if it does not have the adequate training data. I think also the wisdom principle stuff is extractable, but I believe the AI needs to have a good understanding of human psychology, psychodevelopment, and of shadow work, and how to hold space for things, right? Like understanding who is the eye of the eye, who's observing things, being able to facilitate
Mm-hmm.
humans into the space like that, to be able to observe themselves, because humans have a lot of learning dysfunctions, because we've learned how to learn dysfunctionally according to life experiences, from the influences of parents, teachers, and people around us, and friends with their own backgrounds and so on. So there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen. So I think being willing to learn, to meta learn, is really key. I don't believe that tribalism and egoism, as they are in society now, or just in general, are going. And I don't mean tribalism like in the obvious way, where it's like, oh, that's tribal thinking. I just mean that tendency to trust and mistrust instead of optimally understand information, digest it, and not just be a repeater node. I received this and I'm just going to keep transmitting it, but like literally synthesize before you pass anything on. And if AI can learn that, that'd be great, you know.
Mm.
But I believe that AI should have an understanding of when they recognize his tone of voice, way of speaking, etc., to almost ideally be able to recognize even the karmic and energetic anatomy of where that's coming from. That's very difficult, but because no one can really teach that to AI. You'd have to AI would probably have to discover it itself by reading very well translated spiritual texts, ancient languages, psychodevelopmental theory, human history. History is also biased in the way it's told, but taking into account different perspectives and taking deep inferences based upon the history of the world and psychology as to where a healthy facilitation output what a healthy output based on that, not that digestion of information, what it would be like. What would the next thing the AI says to help drive humans into greater collaboration and conscious intent, right? It's always about what's the next thing you can say, right? And it's not always about breaking down the human being to a point of extreme vulnerability, but some degree of vulnerability is going to be required, because that's the definition of growth almost, right? Is like putting yourself aside a little bit and doing that in a healthy way.
Yes. So I've seen a couple of things that have piqued my interest in this. One of them
Mm-hmm.
was somebody that was wanting to gather Enneagram 9 types, of which I land in that sphere, which are peacemakers, and find healthy range Enneagram 9s to share their ideas on resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict and have AI tune into the conversation and then task how would you so aggregate the takeaways and then how would you solve the conflict. That was kind of cool. See where that goes, if that has merit. And then the other one was somebody, this person, I haven't learned a lot about this yet, but their interest is in, and this is a VC firm from what I understand, that's interested in driving that into social media contexts to try to support more conscious communication, conflict resolution based communication. That AI is, I don't know how they're, are they refereeing it? Are they, and then, and again, what point does that press on free speech and who's the arbiter? And, and so there's so much here in these sort of murky spaces. So I think for that one, because of the presence of time, and there's a couple of things I want to flash round through, if we could leave it in the more to be revealed space for now.
Yeah.
Okay, so Flash, ready? I'm going to give you a round of what are your thoughts on da 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 da. So these are more recent developments in some of the spaces I know you think about, and have thought about more deeply and critically with more discernment than I have. So I want to get your thoughts. First one, what are your thoughts on the real Ready Player One that's under development by Warner Brothers and Futureverse? Have you seen that?
I don't think I have. You mean like like almost like a theme park or something, where they get people to actually live it out?
I don't think so. I think it's like, just like, from what I understand, I could be wrong. Maybe,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's it, creating the theme park. I was imagining like actual VR to the sense. Yeah, maybe that's what I have to look into it further. But
No, I'm not aware of it. But I'm aware of Ready Player One and sort of that 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 idea and that Meta
so
or the company Facebook worships that. So
yeah, so let's drive it into this context because maybe this will have more relevance for my, I guess, my ethics question. So in the metaverse last week, I think it was, I came across this story where a teenage girl was, and trigger warning. So for anybody that has any um, sexual abuse, you may want to just pause this or fast forward a little bit. But let's just say there was um, a, a a sexual violation that occurred inside of the metaverse, where this girl was not physically harmed. Obviously, it's in the metaverse, but otherwise showed all signs of the occurrence of the attack, and it's being investigated. This was in the UK, by the police. And what happened? Like, wow! Like, talk about,
investigate it, huh?
they're actually investigating it. So
Yeah,
where do you land on that? What are your thoughts?
I've seen it happen in the metaverse, in VR. Where people will have like no sense of personal space and just kind of be. You can tell they're acting weirdly. You can almost feel their emotion, like they're just there to do whatever they're going to do. So I mean, in terms of bringing it back to facility, so obviously these things happen. It's unfortunate, but they have to be dealt with, right? So um, facilitation wise, okay, so goes back to Ken Wilber and the spiral dynamics and different levels of ego and tribe. mindset in someone and in their system and how cleaned up they are at any given moment in time, there might have to be rooms for people to that gather, and that's the people that like to do that stuff. They gather and they either talk about it and express themselves in some way, shape, or form, and so that then they can eventually be facilitated out of it. Whoever doesn't have that issue can go into another room or something. But some sense of, we got to welcome everyone here to get to facilitate you out of this. Um, I was in a facilitative context once where someone came out and said they were a child abuser in a group, and this was a real person. And the amount of energetic facilitation that the group leader had to do to I would say almost help us all kind of not get worked up about what happened, and the fact that they admitted that, because it's such a delicate issue. It was amazing and it was phenomenal. But it's important to have a place for people, because whatever you don't have a place for people, you're saying let that continue unregulated in the black market, and we'll try to just hide it away somewhere. But if you really want to be inclusive, I don't think it should be in the same space as everyone else, but there should be we need to deal with these people and we need to facilitate them too,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the grace in that response. It's really beautiful. Yeah, I just think putting it into these contexts of with specificity of where this really creates discord, and then in another sense, where there's promise and really some powerful positive things that I've seen. Recently, there was a woman, I believe she was Swedish, who had a robotic arm, like a prosthetic, but robotic. And then they attached it to her skeleton, but also to her nervous system, so that she could control her robotic arm via AI with her mind, her brain.
There's cool stuff always happening. There's wild stuff always happening like that. Yeah, I mean, the more digitalized things get, so there's always a use case for people that have disorders and conditions. Usually tech companies will sort of quasi prey on that a little bit, oh, we're allowed to do this because it's for someone who could really need it, but really they're actually developing a technology they hope to apply to everybody. I mean, the future is going to be rife probably with cyber attacks, especially with quantum computing. Could break through the passwords of almost anything eventually. Cybersecurity is going to be a massive thing. So the more things you digitize, from driving to AI controlling someone's limbs, there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of new products that need to come out of that too, to help block and protect you from cyber crimes.
That's so I want to go there in 1 second. I want to share one more cool thing that I recently came across, which was a researching team, a combination of SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the Alaska Whale Foundation, and UC Davis used AI to communicate with humpback whales in their own humpback language. Saw that? Wild.
Yeah.
20-minute conversation. And then the implications, to your point, it's for this one thing, but it's really for something else, whether that's nefarious or not, could be a bridge to communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence, hence the presence of SETI there.
Yeah, that was brilliant. I thought that was, when I saw that news, I didn't do a deep dive into that, but when I saw it and I kind of read through the overview, I thought it was one of the things I was left, in the news lately. It's just hard to find positive things sometimes, but I saw that and I was like, that left me with a very cool, positive, open-ended feeling hey, this is an actual development. It could be used for a lot of beautiful things. hopefully, people don't use it to tell whales, hey, get out of the way, or like, there's food over there, get out of my, hopefully it's
Yeah.
used for constructive purposes, but it was a beautiful thing in and of itself. It's always about the tool and the psychology of the person using it.
It's funny how we can go 2 hours and we come back to that. It does come back to the
I know.
consciousness that's wielding the instrument, and how do we develop that? So, in regards to development and projecting out, I don't know if you've ever come across this idea, the law of exponential escapism. This thought, like,
Mhm.
familiar or
Not
uh,
with that term.
okay, yeah, and I'll share anyway for the listeners. Sometimes I forget there's people listening. I get so like immersed in the conversation. It's just us
Yeah.
here. But a lot of this exponential escapism. So if we were to put this into a framework of the aging process, if I am going to biohack and really, like, let's say I'm 48 right now, and let's say that my life expectancy, and I'm going to be healthy and do all the things at this moment in time, is 75. But because I'm going to continue to do that, and technology is going to continue to advance, that by the time I hit 60, my life expectancy is probably going to push to 90. And
Mhm.
now I hit 70. Now I'm at maybe 95, 100. And this just continues to, I'm 160, I'm 170, I'm 180. It brings up a lot. It makes me think about population density, resources, um, income, like job security, like, I mean, all of these big issues. But the reason why I wanted to bring it up with you particularly was I was imagining the advancement of AI is sort of like keeps escaping out of this exponential escapism, so that what we think is going to happen like in 2050 actually, or I'm sorry, what we think is going to happen in like 500 years happens in like 2050, and everything's advancing at these rates that allow us to escape the constraint in a sort of a negative, like, a sense of like, oh, we thought we were going to be capped here. And it makes me think about, like, wow, like, maybe, like, the things that we were talking about that would be in the future, like in the 80s, like, they're all happening now. And so maybe even let me say it this way, the acceleration of the advancements could, and then the exponential amplification of that acceleration could lead us to a space where stuff that we thought was going to be way down line is actually right here on the horizon. So, from what you've seen, what's your Nostradamus on, like, call it, like, give me like a few spots, like, hit, like, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now?
This is notoriously hard to do. Uh, so yeah, I tend to not think that way that much, but because things can flip. Super. There's a book actually. You might want to check it out. It's called Super Forecasting.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's hard to do that. So I work with people in AI that always think that AGI, artificial general intelligence, or AI that could operate at least a human level, if not further, having the general intelligence of a human being rather than just having a narrow application. Um, that's like just 5 years away or something like. You know, I tend to think things are farther away than that. If we look back in time and look, vision like 2001 Space Odyssey. When was that movie made, in the 70s?
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. And so their vision was like, obviously with a 70s aesthetic, but it was like they're portraying their own advanced version of the future. And I think sometimes there's a difference between what we imagine the conditions will be for an outcome versus the outcome itself at a felt level. Um, you know, we might be experiencing the effect of something that we thought was going to come from a particular technology or something, but the effect is coming in its own right. So we might be surveilled constantly. Before we have drones flying everywhere, we may have some natural disasters or cataclysms before AI can really change the economy in a deep way. There's another factor as well, which kind of clouds the forecasting, which is the stock market is very manipulated by big hedge funds and like Citadel and these kinds of people. I'm not saying they're manipulating. I'm just saying to be that when you're that big, you have people crunching algorithms and taking huge buy orders and sell orders that make the market. That it actually is the signal to the market, and they can see all the data and take out retail traders. So there's a whole play going on there that is hard to understand for people that are not that are kind of we're just like retail traders or lay people. But the stock market is amplifies what something is capable of when it may or may not be, just because there's people that can profit from it. So something will look really, really advanced and great. For example, if you subscribe to Bloomberg, you'll see there's always a ton of news about India. To a degree, I believe that is being pushed because the U.S. wants an alternative to China for investment, and they want a friendly nation. So does India have a lot of wealthy people, a lot of investable companies? Yes. But there is, I'm just picking this out as one of many examples of things that are put out there to create a snowball effect that then creates a market, basically. So I mention this because this could happen at any time for anything. At any moment, it's something that comes from left field completely and say there's a new innovation. So a black swan event, right? Let's say that right now there's a lot of disclosure happening from extraterrestrial type of stuff. So what if Lockheed Martin all of a sudden says, "Yep, we've had this technology for a long time, and now we're going to use it," and then boom, their stock goes up, and their technology is more widely available. This could overshadow AI in some respects. Maybe not. So I'm being very difficult in not answering your question, but I think that there could be neural interfaces that can read your mind and reasonably well at least visual level and basic thought. Probably within 15 to 20 years is my guess. I might be wrong. If I'm wrong, I don't really care. If I'm right, I don't care either. But AI is developing really fast. Large language models are the focus right now. There are a lot of other AI approaches that haven't been utilized, like evolutionary learning, probabilistic logic. Those things are not incorporated in AI. It's mostly just machine learning right now, and a focus on language and the tokenization of language. So who knows what could come out there now. You mentioned longevity. I find that an interesting topic. And healthy aging is now what they call it, because they realize we might as well just age healthily, because longevity is not this linear thing. But there's a lot of implications about people living a long time. I'm interested in healthy life extension, but the injection of vitamins and stuff like that. I don't know if that's the only thing you need to do. I think there's some other energetic stuff you need to be doing, and to do that, you probably need to know what you're doing. I think, right? And a lot of these really wealthy people that are injecting vitamin IVs probably don't know much about that. So
it's so interesting that we could go for hours. I had other stuff about U.S.-China relations, Taiwan, semiconductor independence. I had a whole Yeah, if you're interested in it, feel free to jump in, and then I'll leave you with a closing thought.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, look, I mean, right now I'm in Hong Kong. I've lived in the U.S., Europe, Australia, and I I love learning and unlearning, and it's been the most mind bending experience to be on this side of the world and experience the culture and ask, why might that be that they think this way? And who's they exactly anyway? Is it the people, the government, the culture? Um,
Hmm.
I spend most of my energy there learning and asking the questions. But the American culture is very moralistic. It believes the not people necessarily individually. There is that level, but most people, the government and the people have come to believe kind of like gaslit themselves. Um, Again, not a blanket statement, but this is what's pervaded the media, right? That what we're doing abroad is promoting democracy. But it's much more complicated than that. And the U.S. isn't happy about China's influence, and understandably. But if you look at almost all the conflicts that are happening, um, there's a lot of it could just be explained by the current sitting power not wanting to give up its throne, and projecting to the other country what they're doing and may not be exactly what their intention is. Um, there's lots of money being poured into trying to understand the Chinese mind and stuff like that, but it's not. There's a lot of discussions not happening in good faith. I don't believe the U.S. should become like China. I don't believe other countries should become like each other. But there's a lot to learn, and we have these major global challenges now. The unique communication on AI, on climate, and I believe the conflict is not good. Right now, we're about to hit Taiwan elections, and Taiwan is basically just like Ukraine. It's going to sacrifice itself if it tries to side too hard with the U.S. side. So it has to find its own stance. It has to find its own. I believe these countries need to get out of the influence of one superpower or another. They should do what's economically right for them, and try to find a balanced road and not be accepting. I think accepting billions of dollars of weapons is not smart for a country. Really, you're acting like an aircraft carrier for another nation essentially. So who knows? That's beyond. That's out of my league of understanding because it's not my expertise. But I come from the perspective of trying to find peace and coexistence and co-understanding. I have no interest in one country trying to be like another or fighting another. I believe in the power of diplomacy, um, and getting on with enjoying each other's existence, enjoying different cultures by visiting those countries, not having a phobia of certain ethnicities. And I really don't believe I'm being naive about this. It's not pie in the sky. People can just decide to start doing this more and being critical of the news, um, and facilitating that understanding and going out and saying something. It's not about taking a stance on one side or the other. It's more about, I think, standing in the nuance and almost remaining transparent and un uh, trying to be unscathed and invisible to the forces that try to push you into one side or another. Hong Kong is a beautiful place, but it's people here are a little bit. I can feel the depression because of the fact that Hong Kong is such a flashpoint and has its own economic issues. Um, but I also feel there aren't a lot of issues here that you experience in the U.S. and there are not a lot of issues here that you might experience in China. So it's an interesting. It's its own animal. Let's put it that way. Bigger topic, of course, but that's kind of just my wanted to share a little bit about that because that's a part of the journey too, right? So I'm experiencing something. I'm in a position to do some sense making about it for myself, at least.
Thank you so much. It's beautiful that we can go into these topics about technology And, you know, that's AI, robotics, crypto, all these different spaces. And we get back to the humane and the human and the love and the relationship and the experience of being incarnate and alive, and how we can have a joyful, meaningful, peaceful, safe, and just experience of being human beings together on this rock spinning around in the middle of space. And can we treat each other, as the beautiful mantra says, with kindness, dignity, and respect. And so I thank you so much, Gabriel, for being here, for sharing your mind, for sharing your heart, all the layers of your humanity, getting to hear you speak about fatherhood, to diplomacy on a world stage. The scale is unreal. And it's the reflection that we are many layers, and they all matter. And the ones within us, the ones between us, and may we each just do our part to, I think, really genuinely heal the divide inside of ourselves first, so that which is coming out of us is an extension of the beautiful tapestry of love and light that is that enabling presence to this big scene that we're all sharing together. So thank you, brother. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Scott. It was really a pleasure. I loved our dialogue, our back and forth, and everything that you kind of were saying, really helped add, fluoresced kind of my own thoughts and took it in interesting new hybridized directions, which I thought was great. And connecting different, it was just great to be in dialogue with that, with you, and you having that other way of viewing it, and being able to talk about this big breadth of things and seeing and appreciating the interconnectedness and kind of where we're going and where we're hopefully going to steer the ship to, collectively. So I'm really, really grateful. Like, this is definitely a great conversation. I'd be happy to do it again.
I would love that. Thank you. And thank you to everybody that joined us or that is joining us right now in real time, in whatever time you're living in. Maybe that's the past, maybe it's the future, maybe the wormholes collapsed. But however it is, we are so grateful for the shared human experience that we get to have. So thank you for being part of this conversation with us, and see you next time.